watch a short lecture. Where you were able to watch a short lecture posted on social media and YouTube about MIMAC, the military industrial media academic complex. And now you're able to join and ask all the kind of different questions that you have and have a discussion, debate, or whichever form of communication you prefer with Jan Oberg live within the next 1 hour.
Yes, I am live.
Yes, we very much hope so. Yes. And I just to remind everyone that this conversation will be recorded. So if you would not like to be on the video, please make appropriate adjustments, turn off your camera and such. We record it so we would be able to share the content with as many people as possible, because we really believe that peace should be researched and talked about and discussed. And obviously our conversations and ideas should be shared in the future. So that's the reason why we would really like to record the result of this conversation. And the way it will function, I would invite all of you to write your questions in comments in a Zoom session. And I will be able to see those comments and call your name and invite you to ask your question live. And we will do that so we can avoid repeating questions or any kind of audio disturbance, so we can have interesting and smooth conversation, all of us, isn't it? We also can get questions from our Facebook live feed, or we already have a few questions under YouTube video. So we will try to gather a little bit from everywhere. And I hope I didn't forget anything. Jan, Justus? Did I cover it all?
You never forget anything, I know that.
Thank you. So it's great having you all here, and I will not use any more of your time. And I think we shall just start, isn't it? And I know that we have already a question left by Yekaterina Kulika, and I am not sure if she joined us today, right now or not. But nevertheless, she asked the question, so I think it would be great to start from there. Yeah. So Yekaterina's question is, what MIMAC needs money for? Where the profit goes from all the weapons sold and from all the business interactions?
What does MIMAC need do with the money?
Yes.
Okay. But usually, as I think I mentioned in the video, there is a special market situation in the sense that there is only one consumer, one buyer, and that is usually the state. The state orders some companies to produce an aircraft or something like that. And then usually the normal thing is that you have a cost overrun, which is then having to be paid by the governments. And that everything the MIMAC does originally comes from taxpayers' money. It's the Ministry of Defense of the governments who have a defense budget, and out of that defense budget, you pay for new weapons, you pay for soldiers, you pay for bases abroad or whatever it is. It's all paid by us sitting here. As long as we pay tax, we contribute to this system, so to speak. Then if you say, where do the money go? When a company has produced a plane or cruise missile or something like that, it of course gets the payment from the government, and it plows that into new projects, new, let's say, research, producing more weapons, expanding, doing new things, going into new areas, or which is quite typical. This is very research and technology intensive production. You know, it's not like a school class, it's high tech and it's laboratories and all that, and it's awfully expensive. So I suppose that you plow some of the money you earn into, of course, you pay your workers and all that, and then you plow the money into further consolidating your capital situation, capital also in the sense of technology and laboratories and all that. And then the rest goes to the shareholders. People who own the company. I mean, these companies are all private shareholding companies, big corporations with thousands of millions of people who have shares. And they are then paid, you know, like any other company. If there's a profit, which there usually is, you can hand out parts of that profit to your shareholders. And that's, in a way, it's a normal way. That's how profit is done. If you do if you lose money on the production, then you cannot give anything to your shareholders. But that's how it goes. You know, that's one reason you have 1% of the American people being outrageously rich compared with the rest of the people, because these shareholders get basically millions of dollars in profits because they're shareholders. So this is in a way a normal capitalist operation, but it's special in the sense that the price of the commodity is decided by the company basically, and not by the purchasers or the market situation, because there's no supply and demand. There's only one who says, produce this weapon for my government. But we're talking about enormous amounts of money. People are usually not aware what the global military expenditures are, but they are about $2,000 billion. If you put together the so-called defense or military budgets of all the countries in the world, we're talking about that, of which the United States alone stands for about 40%. The US is larger than the next 8 or 9 in terms of military expenditures. And if you think that Russia is a big threat, I would like to add that Russia's military expenditures are 8% of NATO. And only if you're a madman or suicidal or mentally ill would you start a war against somebody who has 12 times more, you know, to fight with. If you have one horse, I don't think you would attack somebody who has 12 horses. So to put it that way, you know. So this whole thing is something we need to discuss much more, because it's a huge drain on resources that should, in terms of research and in terms of capital investments and in terms of new technologies, should go to instead solve the climate change problems and other urgent issues, including medical research or whatever it is. If you took away all the military in the world, we would have fantastic opportunities to solve the world's problems. But this military, both politically and economically, is standing in the way of everything we need to do. If nothing else, because of its enormous size. You should be aware that what the world's countries spend on the military is something like, don't hang me completely on it, but it's something like 30 times more than the countries invest in the United Nations and everything the United Nations and its family of organizations do. These are the priorities of the world, and they have to change.
Okay, thank you, Jan. It was a good ease into the topic, if I can call it like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
And then we will start maybe by getting a question from Justas, and then I already see some popping up in the chat, so that is really great. I will encourage everyone to write their questions in the chat, and we will slowly go through those step by step. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. If where and when did exactly do you think MIMAC, this whole concept, started to grow? What was the pretext for it to came to be? Because it was mentioned in the 60s and 70s about military-industrial complex. Yeah, so where do you think it began from?
Well, that in one way you can say it's always existed, because as long as there's been, let's say, industrial societies that produce weapons, it has had some kind of, you know, drive in that direction. But where it has taken off hugely is after the Second World War. The American economy was converted very quickly from civilian production to military production during the Second World War. And mind you, everybody says it's very difficult to change from military production to civilian production, to convert economies from the military to the civilian. Whereas nobody had any problems. I never had any problems of changing civilian economies to the military and devoting resources to producing weapons instead if there's a war going on. But let's put that aside. The whole thing here is, it started out, if you will, after the Second World War, and it got a boost when NATO was created, and you got the Cold War, so to speak. I mean, we're back in the late 40s. As you know, the Second World War ended in 45. And then there was a problem, like, what are we going to do with all these weapons producing capacities? And whereas most people seem to think that the Soviet Union, at the time Soviet Union, now Russia, was the one who started out doing bad things in Europe, it only created the Warsaw Pact with itself as the leader after NATO, several years after NATO had set up its own shop as a military alliance. So the moment you have a military alliance, you begin to have cooperation between different economies and their military capacity for production of weapons. And that's from where it has been growing. And then you can say, the more you can fool people to believe that there are enemies all around, the more easy it is to sell and make taxpayers more or less consciously pay for this whole gigantic waste of resources and of their money. Because the implicit deal that is always, is always there is, you pay us your tax money to the defense ministry. We shape a security politics that makes your life and your children live safely. Now, that's where the bullshit comes in. Because if you've had a military alliance since the late 40s, that is 70 years or more, and you're still saying we need more weapons, and there's lots of wars in the world, and there's a new Cold War growing up with Russia after the end of the first Cold War, and now the US particularly, but also Europe, NATO countries are now shaping a new Cold War with China. That is all meant, because they're not real threats, they're all meant to boost the military, industrial, media, academic complex. So if you ask me, where did it start growing? President Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, I think it was in 62 or 63, I don't remember that, said that this would be something that would undermine democracy and the livelihood of civilian production, and that it was a sector outside democratic control that was growing. And, it's now grown, I don't know how many times bigger than it was in the early 60s. So we're in an extremely dangerous situation. And we're in a situation in which unbelievable sums, tax money, researchers, technologies, technicians, the best brains in the world are used for producing weapons and doctrines and not for solving humanity's real problems. That's what I want to convey to you. It's not a matter of money. We talk too much about money, but it's also a matter of money. But when you put a researcher at a very high level with a good education to invent new weapons or kill in a more smart way or something like that, that brain is lost for production of solutions to climate change, to poverty, to inequality, to all the things we need to do for humanity to survive. And of course, money you've spent on the military cannot afterwards be spent on something else. And that's why you have wars also. Sometimes this system needs to test its weapons. And therefore, you intervene here and there. And funnily enough, and very clearly, the biggest military, industrial, media, academic complex is that of the United States. And the United States is also, by any measure, the most militaristic, most interventionist, and most warfare or war-fighting country since 1945. So this is not a matter only of money, it's also a matter of brain drain into meaningless waste and warfare that destroys societies, kill people, produce refugees, destroy the environment, etc. This is why I call it a cancer. If we could get rid of that cancer, we would have a much more healthy world body.
Thank you for this answer. And next, I would like to invite Rune Steenberg. Please unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Sure, thank you very much, and also thank you for your lecture. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the political decisions are made within this complex. I mean, it's all intertwined, of course, as you have shown, and you're adding the media also to it, which I think is very appropriate, especially now. But I'm kind of asking myself, well, how does it get decided which countries to sell to, which not to sell to, which ones to sanction, and which ones to support militarily? If you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, thanks for the question. And yes, that's terribly important. How is it done? It's mostly done outside the democratic procedures because it's typically not something parliaments are deciding. But the long story short is, of course, it depends on what decision we're talking about. If the decision to go to war, for instance, it's usually passing in some kind of way on a very loose information basis, passing in a parliament and getting some kind of, endorsement with a majority. If you talk about which countries does country A decide to export some weapons to, that is done by the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the government leadership. If you will, the Prime Minister or the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense. And if you talk about NATO decisions or how do we set up a Cold War against China or Russia now or whatever, that is done through alliance structures. And the dominating country in the world's largest alliance is the United States of America, leading NATO. So I have been so long time in this business here. One trend I can see is very clear. The NATO members are no longer having any reasonable, independent national capacity to decide what's best for them to do or follow or not do. They listen to or take orders from Washington. So when, let's say, the Danish government decides to bomb somewhere in Syria or be an occupying power for 4 years in Iraq at the time, etc., it does so of loyalty with the alliance and the alliance leadership. It has nothing to do with, a thorough analysis of what would be wise to do or whether or not Denmark would be served and having interests or would suffer afterwards or be morally deranged from doing it. You get a telephone call from Washington, basically, and they say, hey, we'd like you to bomb. And then within 48 hours at maximum, there's some kind of decision going through saying, yeah, we're ready to do that. Vroom. And then we start our fighter aircraft.
Can I shortly follow up?
Oh, sure.
Just because, I mean, talking about this as a complex suggests, and you say that in your talk as well, that it's not just governments making this decision. There are some interests, some capital interests behind it. There is the weapons industry that is behind there also. So if we take them into the picture as well, I mean, not in such a formal sense, but maybe a bit more, you say it's often decided outside of parliament, outside of the formal realms. So where and how does it get decided, and who is it actually deciding it, without becoming overly conspiratory, but just to being, I mean, real and realistic, not too naive about it? How are these industries involved in it, and how much is the media just a tool, or how much is the media part of the decision making as well? I mean, where are these decisions made? For instance, to keep on selling arms to Saudi Arabia while they're bombing in Yemen, or to decide not to sell arms to China or Venezuela or whatever. These are decisions that are somehow made somewhere, and it seems to be quite opaque. How and where?
Well, it's a good question because it would require a couple of PhDs. And with some special case studies or something like that. No, the whole thing is, and that's what Eisenhower pointed out in the early 60s, that it is beyond democratic control if it is allowed to develop more and more of it will be outside democratic decision making. That's one reason I do not believe that Western countries and the United States is a democracy, because it's not transparent how these kinds of decisions are made. But let me tell you, when I call it a complex, and he called it a complex, but he called it a military-industrial complex, I call it a military-industrial media academic complex, Complex means that it is a vested interest that come together at meetings or ministries or in think tanks or God knows where they meet physically, in restaurants, I don't know. And there they talk about what they want to do and how best to, shape a worldview or influence media or whatever in the direction of a particular war or selling of a particular weapon system somewhere. It is something that, generally speaking, is very non-transparent. But if you look into a series of, let's say, big American think tanks, you will find that those who run them are not at all independent, as they say. They consist of leaders who have been, let's say, deputy ministers of defense, secretaries of defense, or you have people from the military industry who have suddenly become, having a political job as an assistant secretary of state, or you have a high-level military person who has been out bombing, such as Wesley Clark, for instance, who wanted to become and tried to become Democratic president of the United States after he was the main commander in control in command of bombing Yugoslavia in the 90s. And he's now sitting in a number of think tanks, and they churn out papers, they discuss things over tables and seminars, probably at Zoom meetings too. And then they see different opportunities. If you do this in this country, you do that in that country, or if you create a new Cold War, everybody can say, hey, there's something in it for us. You asked a very important question, and that had to do with, sorry, I had a telephone coming in here, so I was broken off. You asked a question about the media. What I have found now, working quite a lot with how can you explain two things? One, that basically all mainstream Western media are now having the same 10 stories about China, and all 10 stories are negative. And secondly, how do you make basically the same media churn out the same public relations stories about a report or something that comes out? For instance, the argument that China is conducting or having a genocide, an ongoing genocide in the Xinjiang province against the Uyghur people, and they use forced slave labor and all kinds of stuff like that. And when I investigate that, which we've done in one report in my foundation, and we're working on a second one, I find that, media people are also, I can't say instructed, I don't know what words to use, but they are part of it because they are the ones who sell the opinion, let's say a negative view of China, so that it becomes logical and acceptable that we guard ourselves, that we arm against China, that we have negative views because they are such bad guys over there. The same applies to Iran, the same applies to Russia, the same applies to, even Eastern European countries. Everybody who works with China are now bad guys, etc. The difference being from 20 or 30 years ago, you could always come out, get through some kind of cracks in the media wall. I remember myself reporting here and there from, Iraq war or something like that. From Syria and on, 5 years ago, there is no way people who argue for peace, who have been on the ground like myself, who've seen things that are different from the media narrative, and who is working with China and know that China is not only bad as we hear now, we do not get through those cracks anymore. There are no cracks. It's orchestrated. I can't tell you exactly how it's made, but I can give you an example. And that's very telling to me, and everybody listening to this here should be scared like hell of the consequences of it. The US Congress has a law now passed, which I think it was yesterday actually, which is called the China Competition Act. The designation of it is S1169. It's a 270 pages law. which says that the US shall now outcompete China in all fields. And it adds, and that's where it comes in as relevant to what I'm saying to you now, it adds that the next 5 years, $300 million shall be used every year, that is $1.5 billion, on training journalists in writing only negative stories about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is the world's and history's largest cooperative civilian effort. The Belt and Road Initiative are the new Silk Roads, if you will. Now, when you have a law now in the United States that says we are not going to have freedom of the press, we are not going to have different views on China, we're going to have one view, and we're going to pay journalists courses and influence them so they only write negative stories. That is the end of democracy. That is the end of public information, the public's ability to form their own opinion about what is going on. And that comes in support of a new Cold War that satisfies the profit needs of the military industry, more research money on nuclear weapons and civilian conventional weapons, etc. This is, if you will, a long answer to your question, but these groups are coming together, and it ends in this case up in a huge law about how the US shall fight China in the future and not cooperate, but outcompete. And for them to sell this idea and to sell to the taxpayers that we must now pay more because now we have a new enemy called China. You sell the idea that China is a dictatorship, that it is doing awful things, it has slave labor, it has this and blah, 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 and it has no human rights, and it has no Western democracy. Now, excuse me, China happens to be a country which is not Western, and therefore it operates on different thinking. That's a long story why it is like that. I'm just saying, by law, the US has now decided to undermine the freedom of the press and the free opinion formation, and will also completely exclude people like me and others who know a little bit about the world and have different views. For instance, that we shall not have a Cold War with China because there's no good reason for it. And it will destroy the ability to do something we need to do for humanity, solving the real problems of the world. But the West cannot live without enemies. That psychology is very interesting. Why do we have to have enemies all the time? One day the Russians, one day the Chinese, one day the Iranians, one day the North Koreans. We always have somebody to legitimate that we need more weapons, more armament. This is a sick society and a sick way of reasoning. So that's a long answer to your question, but it is complex issues, and I'm sorry that it gets a little long, but you know, I'm sick and tired of everything that people think can be explained on Twitter or Facebook.
That's exactly the reason why we have this conversation, isn't it? That we have a lot of space to
yes, no, boy, I appreciate being a part of it.
We do. Okay, just a quick reminder for everyone on Facebook and here in Zoom, please feel free to share your questions in chat. Also, those who are on Facebook, we are reading the comments in the live stream and we are paying attention and we are able to ask them here. So yeah, Norbert, it not necessarily actually needs to be a question. It can be an aspect of a topic or a certain follow-up you might want to hear more about. So don't feel pressure to formulate great questions. Just share your thoughts and ideas with us, yeah? And the next person I would like to invite to ask a question is Marie Forel. So please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay, yes, I wanted to hear if you have some suggestions for what people like us can actually do to influence power, to de-escalate military buildup and nuclear capacity.
Well, that's a classical what to do question. And I think we're all, to a certain extent, I would say, well, let me speak for myself. I'm overwhelmed by the fact that these things are going so fast in the wrong direction. And the whole question about peace, disarmament, nonviolence, genuine conflict resolution when you have conflicts, etc., are totally out of the discourse. You have not for years heard an expert or anybody else, even a politician, mention the word peace on a television screen. This word is out. It's no longer relevant. Whatever goes on, you hear Stoltenberg and NATO Secretary General saying, whatever we do, it contributes to peace, stability, and security. I mean, this is a mantra, no matter what they do. If they start a nuclear war tomorrow, it'll be for peace, stability, and security. This is total bullshit intellectually. Academically, it's not worth the bandwidth they use. But what we all must do is study circles. It is to know things. It is to use the media. It is to use the social media. It's to use every dinner conversation to say, hey, are you aware of what's going on about China? Or would you like me to tell you a little bit about why we're now having a Cold War with China for no good reason? It is a matter of reading books. Most people don't read books about complex issues anymore, and therefore they know too little. It is a way of not believing that the truth is in your mainstream media. I mean, if you think you get any kind of comprehensive, truthful, worldview through seeing CNN or whatever you come from, your national newspapers, liberal or right-wing or left-wing or whatever, I say you're fooling yourself. The only way you can get a solid sense of what is going on in the world is to surf the net yourself, pick up information from different reliable sources, learn what you can trust and what you cannot trust. There is a huge amount of deliberately deceptive information available on the net today. This whole thing about the Uyghurs in China is based on estimates, on people who have repeatedly said, and media who repeat what they have said, and think tanks who repeat what the media and individuals have said for political reasons, that there's 1 million to 2 million, perhaps 3 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang who have been in confinement, detention, or concentration camps. There is not one place in which this is documented. It's only estimates. I could say 10 million. I could say 5 people. This is the kind of thing that, we're in a situation in Western democracies where you do not know unless you acquire knowledge yourself. You do not know when you are fooled. Most people, by far the majority today, are fooled if they listen to the primetime news on their television, national television, public service, which is no longer public and no longer service. And if that's when they say, oh, well, we've heard the stories of the world today. First of all, you hear very little about the world outside your own country. If you live in Denmark or Sweden or something like that, you probably, in the best of cases, hear something happening in Europe. But you don't hear anything happening for real somewhere else. And secondly, you are told one narrative. There is only one truth. You are not told a diverse view. You are not seeing experts with different backgrounds giving you different interpretations of what has happened. You are not getting certain perspectives, such as I said, you have 10 negative stories about China, but you don't have 10 positive stories, which I could enumerate in no time, etc., etc. Now, long story short, you've got to study it yourself. And when you think you know something, spread it to those you're close to, family, friends, colleagues, whatever, and start writing about it. Shout about it, do videos, do things like the DNS is doing, educate young people, whatever you're in a position. I used to say, there is no peace movement, but everybody is a peace movement. You two sitting here asking me questions, me as a researcher, we are all peace movement, but we are an individual peace movement because we cannot sit down and wait for others to take a leadership and be peace leaders for us. That time is over. We must from below present solid evidence and know things and read books and disseminate it in opposition to the crap that comes out and deliberately tries now to deceive us to believe certain things which are empirically untrue. So I say activity, 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 get going before it's too late, young people.
Okay, thank you very much.
And don't trust authorities.
No.
Thank you, Marie, for the question, and Jan for the answer. In the same line, talking about what to do, I would like to give a question from Delia from Facebook live stream, and she would more specifically like to understand how is it we can, or do we have a choice to pay or not to pay taxes while investing in this complex? And do we have any kind of influence on that?
Well, there have been certain initiatives throughout history of people who set up a fund and said, well, it's not just that we keep the money ourselves, but we put it into a fund, and until disarmament has happened, this fund will be under our control, so to speak. It's called something like, you can find it in small groups, of course, something like, you know, taxpayers for peace or taxpayers for disarmament or something like that. But the idea is you find out how much of your tax money goes to the military, whereas 5%, 40% or whatever it is of the government's, of your government's budget. And when you go, you know, then know, of course, when you do your tax declaration, you know how much you're supposed to pay. So if you know that the government's military expenditures are about, let's say, 25% of your government's total expenditure, you keep 25% of what you should have paid and put that into that fund. Now, this can only work if millions of people are doing it, because it is not a legal thing to do. It's breaking the law, if you will, to not pay tax. But it would be impossible to sue everybody who does it. Let's say like 200 million people in a country decides collectively to not pay to the military. Then, of course, you know, they'll have a problem of processing 200 million people in courtrooms. I mean, that would be a huge expansion of courtrooms and judges and lawyers and all that. So this doesn't help if 15 people are doing it in the capital or in a village somewhere in the countryside. It has to be something that becomes huge, a snowballing effect. We are not paying tax for warfare, violence, killing children and women and men in other cultures, and we are also not paying for a new Cold War against this and that country. We would like to pay to peace and friendship and cooperation. This is possible, and in a way, the foundation must be set up according to, you know, rules. It must have a board, it must have, you know, all these kinds of things. But of course, it would be doable, and that would take the military, industrial, media, academic complex with its pants down, because it cannot operate if it doesn't squeeze out, exploit, usurp the taxpayers' money. It doesn't come from anywhere else. They don't produce anything themselves that would give them money to do this. So it's a brilliant idea. It has been tried, but it has never, caught the energy that is necessary to get millions of people to say, yes, I'm also evading tax, putting it into a fund, and until my government does what I want with this, it will stay in that fund. With huge human solidarity across the world.
Yeah, as every solution, it can be pretty complex, isn't it? And it's actually one of the most popular questions. I think people are really, which is great, isn't it? People are really searching for ways to solve. Okay, and the next question, Henning Helmut would like to ask. So if you would unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, Henrik Hedlund here.
Hello.
Hello, John. I have a question related to MIMAC and nuclear weapons. I know that you will later on this autumn talk about nuclear weapons, but I would see if you can say something about the relationship that we now have an international UN treaty to ban nuclear weapons, and that it's quite many countries now that has ratified it. I think it's at least 160, and more countries that has signed the treaty, but still a number of countries that has refused to sign it. And of course, no surprise, all the countries that has nuclear weapons. My question, will this in any sense has some sort of pressure on the MIMAC and the way we will deal with nuclear weapons in the future? Will this put the pressure on the nuclear countries to disarm nuclear weapons? Do you have any thoughts there, John?
You mean if the military-industrial complex was shrunk, was disarmed,
or if the MIMAC, in a sense, has been hopefully thinking in a new direction when this treaty was signed and ratified by so many countries, and if that may help the cause to really disarm when it comes to nuclear weapons. Do you have any thoughts there?
Your assumption here is built on an illusion about knowledge and intellectual capacity in ministries of foreign affairs and elsewhere. Plus, I think you're overestimating grossly the ethical dimension of foreign policy and security politics. They don't care about these things.
Understood.
Unfortunately, I think what you have to do is again, I don't want to frighten people, but we have to get it back to the knowledge and the consciousness. And I think I've said it before in these seminars, we can all be gone tonight. We are living under the threat that nobody has ever allowed other people to have and to be able to exert that control and influence over us. The threat that nuclear weapons can be used any moment by technical failure, by human failure, by a madman, by unauthorized use, or by somebody, terrorist or whatever. And of course, by a government that finally sees that it has lost the game. And what can you do? You can either go down with a whimper or you can go down with a bang. We should be very happy and grateful to Gorbachev 30 years ago that he decided not to blow up and use nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union was over. So what we do have now, let's look at the strength we have. We have a moral strength. There is no moral theory that can justify nuclear weapons being used. Intellectually and philosophically, you can, and I'm not going into it, but you can perhaps argue that there is a certain element of or ability to avoid war or prevent war through nuclear weapons. But that's a long story, and I'm not an adherent of that philosophy. The world would be safer without it. Politically, they cannot be used because there is no political purpose that would justify the killing of millions of people, and millions of people will go even with a small nuclear detonation somewhere, tactical nuclear weapons of course, in a populated area. And the long-term environmental consequences would be huge. Militarily, they are useless. Because if you use nuclear weapons on your own territory to defend against an invasion, you destroyed your own society. And if you want to use them to invade another country, you will control that new country as a nuclear radioactive desert. So there is nothing else that justifies or explains the existence of nuclear weapons but profit, technology, investments, corporations wanting to have them, military feeling that they are a prestigious weapon to have. And that's probably the main reason today that some countries have them. You cannot quite bully somebody as much if he or she has nuclear weapons. You know, somebody, you know, like Gaddafi, for instance, had to learn the lessons because he said, I'm never going to get nuclear weapons. And a few years later, he was murdered. He could have started having nuclear weapons. He could have made Libya a nuclear country. The smart ones are not doing that like Iran. They know that that is not a good thing. The less smart ones are those who have nuclear weapons in the Middle East, which only Israel has that. And then the other big countries which are resting their prestige, their special character, their identity on being nuclear weapons. Countries are possessing nuclear weapons. So the long story short is the strength we have is that there are no good arguments. And you and I can ask, why do we not hear that there are no good arguments for nuclear weapons in our newspapers, in our primetime television? Why don't we see the experts on all these things? Why do we only see military people who say, of course, we cannot disarm the military. That's the last thing we would do. The second strength is that we have this treaty from January this year, which bans nuclear weapons. And a majority, big enough, more than 50 countries have now signed and ratified that treaty. That means nuclear weapons are illegal.
Exactly.
Those who have them are criminals according to international law.
Yes.
Third, I don't know anybody who likes terrorism or terrorists, but nuclear weapons are weapons of terrorism. Because terrorism means to have or use weapons or means, tools, which aims at killing or harming non-combatants and civilians who are not party to a conflict. That's the definition of terrorism versus warfare. Now, everybody who has nuclear weapons today, be it China or Russia or the US or Britain or France or Pakistan or India or Israel or who God knows who has it, North Korea, are all adherents to and advocates of the philosophy of terrorism, just like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Rote Armee-Fraktion or whatever. It is a terrorist philosophy because you can't use them without killing millions of innocent civilians. So we're talking about the world's terrorist states.
Excellent.
And back in time, we always talked about the balance of terror. That was when A and B had equally many nuclear weapons, so they knew that if you start killing me, I have something left on my submarines with which I can kill you, and therefore we won't have it. They were all called balance of terrors, meaning those who had nuclear weapons were terror states, part of a terror balance. Now then came 2001, 9/11 and all that, and then the community of manipulators decided that we don't call nuclear weapons terrorism anymore. The only thing we call terrorism are small groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I mean, you haven't heard in Western press or anywhere else that nuclear weapons holders are adherent of a terrorist philosophy. And you have only heard that the terrorists existing in the world are those small groups. You've never heard the term government terrorism or governmental terrorism. Those who have nuclear weapons, those countries are governmental terrorists. So there are two types of terrorism. There's civilian, if you will, private small group terrorism, and there's state terrorism. And the world should not accept to live any longer under state terrorism. If you want nuclear weapons, and the last thing I'm going to say about this, if you want nuclear weapons, have a referendum. Ask your people, dear fellow Americans, dear fellow Russians, do you want us to continue to have nuclear weapons in self-defense of the Russian territory or the French territory or the American territory? Now, if you do that, you will find, according to opinion polls, that less than 5% would like to have nuclear weapons. If you add the question, would you accept having nuclear weapons used on your territory in a defense situation against an enemy? You're down to 1% or less. It is totally incompatible with democracy to have nuclear weapons, and that's why nobody was ever asked. The nuclear power states just got these weapons. NATO is an alliance resting upon it. Nuclear weapons are not mentioned in NATO's treaty. So long story short, there's so many strong arguments against nuclear weapons. But the military, industrial, media, academic complex, not the least the media, are preventing most people from seeing that that is the case.
Thank you for your answer and for the question, Henrik. I definitely got some new insights. So we will have just 1 or 2 last questions now. So I'm sorry if
How do you
someone...
know? How do you know?
Well, we have a little bit of time left, isn't it? There's a question towards a different topic from a Facebook live viewer, Melina Stella. And she's asking, where would you, Jan, put the nowadays refugee solidarity crisis in this complex? And how is it used? Or does it actually make any impact or influence in MIMAC?
The relationship between MIMAC and refugees, that's basically what the question is about.
So yeah, what is the relation? Where does it belong in the topic? What are the connections?
Well, we have had a gigantic growth of the number of refugees in the world. I think it's about 80 million people now who are either refugees, meaning that they have left their country, they have crossed an international border, or they are internally displaced people, IDPs. And the relationship, of course, is very, I wouldn't say very clear. There are some refugees who are fleeing from a dictatorial government, or because they belong to a minority, or they have said things that were not comme il faut, etc. And you have probably also an increasing number or proportion of refugees who are running away because their environment has been destroyed in different ways, and they cannot make a living anymore in certain agricultural areas or along the coast or whatever. But the far majority of those we have seen, for instance, those who in 2015 came to Europe, they ran away from wars. And they ran away from wars that the European states had participated in. Not all of them, but the major ones, such as France and Libya, etc., such as Britain, such as Denmark in Iraq and Turkey, such as the United States, such as, you can mention them all. All these wars in the Middle East have caused people to run away. I mean, is that so strange? And probably, I'm not sure about the figures completely, but one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes in modern times was the one created, or is the one that is unfolding still in Syria, which was a population of about 24 million people. And I think, if I remember correctly, you have had more than 500,000 people killed, and you have had something like, I guess, 3 or 4 million people who run away, either internally in the country or to Europe or to the near area there. Now, what happens in Europe is they say, well, when these victims of our warfare come to Europe, we close the doors. Germany was the only country who with Merkel saying, we are schaffen this. We're going to manage this. The rest said basically, no, we're not going to receive these people. They're coming here to, take our jobs or whatever it is. We don't like all these Arabs and Muslim people coming here, etc. Apparently, it is often thought of, what would Europe have done if those who came to Europe in 2015 had been victims of, let's say, a nuclear power facility going berserk in Israel, and most of them would be Jews coming? Would they also have been treated this way by Europe? So Europe paid its way. It paid Turkey billions of euros to take care of this refugee problem. Turkey, by the way, being one of the most nasty countries in Syria. But, that's a long story. Let's not get into that. What we needed to do as a minimum would be to agree that if we create refugees because of our interventionist wars, we have a damn duty as human beings, as decent people and citizens, to also care for the victims of those wars. We are not even at that moral level today in today's Europe. If you look at Denmark, where unfortunately I was born, well, I can't do much about it. It is now a country that seriously discusses which more or less dictatorial state, Egypt or Rwanda, to send refugees down to, because we don't want refugees, asylum seekers in Denmark. We are at a level which is disgusting, morally speaking, irresponsible, and a consequence of our participation, our meaning all of European countries, participation in warfare. If we didn't have these wars, And if we didn't destroy countries, villages, infrastructure, economic opportunities, beautiful old cities such as Aleppo, there would not be that many refugees. Again, we are seeing how the military-industrial media academic complex is operating only to harm humanity. And still, it's kept, you know, behind a smoke screen, so most people do not see those connections. I've tried now for 5 to 6 years in making the connection between warfare and refugees, wherever I've been speaking. Most people don't see that. I tried to make the connection between COVID-19 and the lack of response throughout all societies, because we never thought of security having to do with health and face masks and protective gear. We thought security had to do with the Russians or Chinese or Iranians. Now, it's impossible to make that because the media do not make that link. And if I made that link in a TV studio, I would not be invited again into any Western media. You are not supposed to challenge. You're not supposed to criticize. You're not supposed to come up with alternatives to warfare, militarism, interventionism, and American dominance of the world. We have to take that conflict with our friends in the US. And I say friends. I've never been anti-American, but I'm against warfare, I'm against militarism, I'm against imperialism. And that's what that country unfortunately stands for today. But I wish them good luck when all this crap is gone and NATO also has fallen apart. The US is going to be a beautiful, wonderful society that everybody wants to work with. But not this America. And when Biden says America is back, I would add, no, America is backward. It has no future keeping on what it does at the moment. And the same goes for countries in Europe who are interventionist and turn away the victims of their own policies. This is the height of moral irresponsibility. It's actually quite sad to see. I've seen enough warfare in my life. I've been working in war zones enough to see what the suffering in these places imply. Not receiving these people is beyond my understanding.
Thank you for your answer. And then I would ask Eustace to ask the last question in this session.
Yeah, I would like to ask Jan, where do we need to look at if we want to see more like positive examples of countries going against MIMAC through policies or through behavior? Yeah.
Well, you can look at all the countries that have nuclear weapons, but you can also make the list of all the countries that have decided not to have it. You know, most countries have it either by constitution or political decision-making, such as Austria, South Africa, Kazakhstan, Sweden, have decided not, made a political decision. We are never going to get nuclear weapons. Perhaps we could gang up somehow with populations in those countries and say, hey, you're on the right side. Can we build strengths together? Can we do an army of anti-nuclearists and nuclear freedomists, freedom fighters, and work with them rather than working against the criminals who have them? That could be one way. You could look for a lot of inspiration from countries that have gone a little bit different paths. And I usually mention Costa Rica, that has no military, probably the safest country in that part of the world. You can look at Switzerland, which has a very elaborate constitution, a very interesting social structure, cantons with high degree of self-determination, but of course a national government, and some of the national government's actions are somewhat deplorable, and they do have a military industry, Oerlikon Böhle and others. But the long story short is, be different. And that's why I say there is no future for, let's say, Denmark following blindly the United States. It will drag us down. When the US goes down, Denmark will go down. And I was very sad to see that we have a leadership now in Denmark, which is totally unable to muster any kind of critical, independent thinking about the Arctic, But when Mr. Blinken comes visiting for a few hours, they are all bowing down. They are all totally loyal. All media are just asking nice and kind questions. And what they do is to participate and only put all the eggs in what do you call that? You know, all the eggs, all the possibilities on one side, namely confrontation, building alliances against Russia and China. If there is a place where we could really cooperate about saving the environment, increasing economic interaction, sharing nature's resources for the best of humanity, etc., it's the Arctic. But what does the Danish government do? It does the opposite. It says, let's build an alliance. And I tell you, in a few years, perhaps not even that long, the United States will control Greenland and everything around it, and probably have troops there too. Expand its bases and all that. And Greenland is also important from a nuclear warfare point of view. It's a long story. I won't go into it here. But the short story, long story short, is look at those who are different. Look at China. Okay, it's a nuclear power, but a nuclear weapons power, but it is an interesting country in terms of social philosophy, in terms of socioeconomic development, in terms of a mixture society of capitalism, socialism, Chineseism, Confucianism, and God knows what, Buddhism. And all these things should be something we investigate. Whenever somebody is different from the West, study them, visit them, make friends with them. I'm not saying we should not be friends with people in the West. I work with Americans every day. They're as concerned about the world and America as I am. But what I'm saying is, we should be curious of everybody who do things differently, because otherwise we get one uniform world that will go to hell together. We don't want that. We don't somebody who has diversity, who thinks independently. Sweden, where I sit, was once upon a time such a country. Today, there's absolutely nothing interesting going on in Sweden. It's the most boring country I can think of. I would never go here as I did 50 years ago. But now I'm sitting here, I have a nice place, but you know, it's not the country that it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Internationally, as well as a society. So yes, study everybody who is different. Don't close off. Visit. Take your next holiday in China, or go to Vietnam, or whatever. Don't educate yourself in the United States. That's the end of it. That's the end station. Go somewhere else and get an education. If you want to study somewhere, go somewhere else. Go outside Europe. Go to Africa. That's what I was saying.
Thank you, Jan. I think it's a great note to finish this conversation.
I forgot to say you should go to DNS, of course. I forgot to say that. Yes, what happened here?
Oh, I think Nadezhda disappeared.
No, we are here again, aren't we?
We are here. I think Nadezhda disappeared. Okay. Anyway.
No, you are here. I'm here.
You're here. I'm here. Everybody else is here, but I think Nadezhda is gone.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. I would like to thank you, Jan, for the lecture and the whole discussion, and everybody who was part. I will just in the chat here share dates for the next courses.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Could we also say to those participants who are here that it would be nice if every one of them mentioned this type of seminar to others?
Yeah, that would be great.
We share the link of your page where the next things are. I mean, we can help each other get the snowball rolling.
Yeah, that's very right. I put now in the chat the link where you can find the past courses and the ones that are upcoming, and you can register. So that's a good link for you to share. And then you can also share this course, because I think if somebody sees it, then they will be tempted to come next time. And even though it's sunny weather, I think it's relevant to dedicate a few hours for peace every month. Oh, super. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, but then maybe we close it off with this. Thank you very much, everybody. If you're
thanks to all of you from me.
Yes, and then we can maybe people are welcome to unmute and give a clap if you feel like it.
Thank you.
Very good.
Great.
And see you in a month's time.
Oh, there you are. Ah, you're back again.
Yes, 8th of
Nesta is
June.
back. Like the US, she's back.
Let's see
Okay,
everyone.
friends.
8th of July.
Yep.
Thank you for today.
Jan, can we keep you for a minute?
Yep.
Super.
It'll cost extra, but okay.
Let me stop the live stream before we talk about that.
There's nothing to